Well, first of all, good afternoon, greetings, and also thanks to Professor Aiken for inviting me. I have to say that unlike Mark Antony and Julius Caesar, I've come both to praise and to bury Reinhold Niebuhr. The praise I am going to offer in this talk is genuine, but I also think that the internment is long overdue. Because I think that Niebuhr continues to cast far too restrictive and censorious a specter over our public intellectual life. Take, for example, his beloved Serenity Prayer, which I think encapsulates the wisdom, but also hints at the shortcomings of his political theology. So I'm just going to recite it now. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom always to know the difference. Now that's a memorable chestnut of piety. It's oft-cited and it's admired as a wizening maxim of existential and political maturity. And its stoical spirit has been invoked by a roster of intellectuals and politicians. As with so many of Niebuhr's pronouncements, we're all expected to stroke our chins and furrow our brows at its stringent gravitas, and take to heart Niebuhr's reminder that our sin and our finitude place inexorable limits on our ability to master the forces of history. There are good reasons, I think, why Niebuhr is the perennial theological favorite of what I'll call very serious people, those politicians and pundits who constitute the powers and principalities of rule and violence and imagination. Would we not want them to be serene and courageous and wise about when to be one or the other? Yet I think this prayer also reflects everything that I consider to be anemic and debilitating about Niebuhr's political theology. The serenity it counsels, I think, turns far too easily into complacence and resignation. The courage, it affirms, flexes its muscles within far too narrow a compass. And the serenity congeals and the courage withers because the wisdom that they demand, otherwise known to Niebuhr and in the Niebuhrian tradition as Christian realism, I think it derives from the canons of reality as defined by very serious people. Now, while I certainly agree that Niebuhr articulated an incisive critique of the liberal Protestant social gospel, and that he offered a salutary, if often unheeded, chastisement of the pretensions of Cold War liberalism, I also think that his political theology cannot provide what we need for our time. As a cleric of what Henry Luce dubbed the American century, Niebuhr quite deliberately intended to lower our expectations of politics, to smother the fire of the era's incendiary political hopes, to constrict and I think even to abort the political imagination, and to inhibit the enlargement of political possibility. As that American century is, in my view, entering a state of descent and demise, Niebuhr's work offers little but a snare, an impediment to the work of political imagination and renaissance on which I think we have to embark in the coming decades. Niebuhr opened his political career as a Protestant firebrand, inveighing against liberal judiciousness and theology and lethargy. It's become almost impossible for us to imagine Niebuhr apart from the unsentimental and at times cynical political intelligence of moral man and immoral society. But it's worth recalling that during the previous decade and a half, as the pastor of Detroit's Bethel Evangelical Church, he had been one of the bright young hopes of the social gospel, eagerly rattling the teacups in the vicarage of liberal Protestant rectitude. Both religious and secular liberals had become tiresome bores in Niebuhr's anything but humble opinion. In a letter to the New Republic published in the summer of 1919, Niebuhr lamented what he called liberalism's, quote, gray spirit of compromise, end quote. Provided with an auspicious moment for social reconstruction in the aftermath of World War I, liberals, Niebuhr charged, balked at the opportunity to, quote, tear down old houses and build new ones, end quote. Liberals lacked fervency, in his view, that, quote, spirit of enthusiasm, not to say fanaticism, which is so necessary to move the world out of its beaten tracks, end quote. Once the vehicle of youthful political exuberance, liberalism was now, Niebuhr mocked, a, quote, philosophy of the middle-aged, end quote. These brazen high spirits animated Niebuhr's pastorage of Bethel Evangelical. They galvanized his rarely cited campaign against the Ku Klux Klan, his criticism not only of Henry Ford, but of Fordist management and mechanization, and his support for the city's labor unions, to the point not only of joining them on picket lines, but of granting organizers access to his pulpit. This is the Niebuhr who embraced pacifism, served as national chairman of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, and joined other liberal Protestants such as Kirby Page, Sherwood Eddy, and Harry Ward in advocating socialism. Long after Niebuhr moved to New York in 1928 and assumed his post at Union Theological Seminary, the radical enthusiasm and critical edge that marked his letter to the New Republic remained, albeit in a diluted form. Niebuhr's embrace of Marxism, together with his enlistment in the more militant wing of the Socialist Party, testifies to the persistence of this radical bravado. Yet his disdain for liberal Protestantism is so palpable in Moral Man that it's easy to forget that, as Niebuhr asserted plainly in the introduction, quote, the ultimate purpose of his book was to find political methods which will offer the most promise of achieving an ethical goal for society, end quote, and objected inflected more by Protestant moralism than by Marxist dialectic. We should keep in mind that Niebuhr's excoriation of pacifism in Moral Man appeared in the midst of a reflection on, quote, religious resources, end quote, for social and political transformation. Likewise, his moral equivalence of violent and nonviolent coercion, however dubious or incisive we may consider it, was intended to clarify the issues at stake, not to, quote, lame the nerve of action, as he put it in Reflections on the End of an Era. Even though he left the Fellowship of Reconciliation in 1934, Niebuhr helped to found the Fellowship of Socialist Christians in 1931 and remained a member well into the 1940s. Niebuhr was even generous enough to write in Moral Man that modern communism is, quote, a secularized but still essentially religious version of the classical religious dream, end quote. Niebuhr's invocation of dreams would seem incongruous in a volume considered often an oar-text of realism. But I've come to think that the most enduring and unassailable insight of Moral Man lies neither in its indictment of pacifism, nor in its discussion of nonviolent resistance, nor in what Christopher Lasch, enlisting Niebuhr's words, praised as its armature for, quote, a spiritual discipline against resentment. I think that the insight rather lies in its passages on illusion and myth, words that Niebuhr uses, the realm of political imagination, as David Graeber might remind us. Myth was a salient topic among American intellectuals in the 1930s. Kenneth Burke calling for a revolutionary symbolism, John Dewey's search for a common faith, C.L.R. James' ruminations on the cultic quality of mass entertainment, or Thurman Arnold's sardonic examination of the folklore of American capitalism. Anticipating all of them, as well as echoing the French syndicalist Georges Sorel, Niebuhr's moral and political psychology in Moral Man emphasizes not rationality or interest, but imagination. Human beings, Niebuhr mused, are, quote, governed more by imagination than by reason, and imagination is compounded of mind and impulse, end quote. Especially when it assumes political form, imagination invents illusions, in Niebuhr's word, which Niebuhr defines not as fantasy or chimera, but rather as enacted fictions, something one, quote, believes to be true and is not wholly true, but ought to be true, and may become true if its truth is not doubted. Something like the imagination of Samuel Coleridge or Wallace Stevens, Illusion for Niebuhr would seem to be a way in which we discern some genuine possibility in reality that is unseen with the eyes of secular rationality. Our action based on that vision, and vision, I think we need to be reminded, is always of something, which is why a visionary is someone who sees, can bring that gestating reality to birth. This is what Niebuhr appears to mean when he writes that, quote, the truest visions of religion are illusions, end quote. It's worth recalling that moral man ends on a note of intoxication rather than sobriety. So I'm going to quote this conclusion. The most effective agents will be men who have substituted some new illusions for the abandoned ones. The most important of these illusions is that the collective life of mankind can achieve perfect justice. It is a very valuable illusion for the moment, for justice cannot be approximated if the hope of its perfect realization does not generate a sublime madness in the soul. Nothing but such madness will do battle with malignant power and spiritual wickedness in high places. The illusion is dangerous because it encourages terrible fanaticisms. It must therefore be brought under the control of reason. One can only hope that reason will not destroy it before its work is done. Now, if, as the saying goes, one governs in prose, Niebuhr was quite well aware that one revolts as well as campaigns in poetry. Niebuhr's account of the promise and perversity of imagination leavened his later work as well, especially the irony of American history. To be sure, this book was Niebuhr's quintessential statement of a gray-flanneled Cold War liberalism. Indeed, it elevated and assured his stature among the clerics of the post-war intellectual and political establishment. But it also extends the analysis of illusion he crafted as a Protestant socialist from the terrain of class warfare to the topography of American nationalism. Though adamant in his conviction that American power and resolve were the only realistic bulwarks against the Soviet Union and revolutionary socialism, Niebuhr was equally insistent that the nation's most pernicious illusion, its, quote, form of spiritual pride, in his words, was its sense of exceptionalism, the nation's conviction of some sort of providential anointment and its delusional belief in its own historical innocence. Like his friend Perry Miller, the great scholar of American Puritanism, Niebuhr observed with profound ambivalence that, quote, from the earliest days of its history to the present moment, there is a deep layer of messianic consciousness in the mind of America, end quote. In Niebuhr's view, the mythology of exceptionalism underlay the American identification of material success with virtue and divine favor, at the same time that it energized its Promethean effort to be, quote, the master of destiny at home and abroad. Now armed with a nuclear arsenal, the United States could no longer afford to subscribe to this farrago of what he called sentimentalities and pretensions. One consequence of the exceptionalist illusion, about which Niebuhr was especially prescient, was the use of economic growth to evade rather than resolve social conflict. What Elizabeth Cohen has dubbed the post-war consumers' republic grew in part, in Niebuhr's view, from the exceptionalist dependence on capitalist prosperity as a sign of national anointment. Quote, Niebuhr, every ethical and social problem of a just distribution of the privileges of life is solved by so enlarging the privileges that either an equitable distribution is made easier or a lack of equity is rendered less noticeable, end quote. The ever-escalating expansion of productivity and consumption in order to pacify class conflict was, by the 1950s, a staple of liberal social thought and politics, a hope that was ballasted by the apparent stability provided by the New Deal order, the hegemony of Keynesian economics among intellectuals, and the unprecedented material abundance and technological innovation that marked what historians have now come to call the Golden Age of Capitalism. Niebuhr was one of the few liberal thinkers who suspected that the Golden Age, and by extension the sense of American exceptionalism, might indeed be short-lived. Quote, "This expansion cannot go on forever," Niebuhr warned, "and ultimately we must face some vexatious issues of social justice in terms which will not differ too greatly from those which the wisest nations of Europe have been forced to use," end quote. America would discover that the vices and antagonisms it thought it had left behind in Europe would not so much return as make their presence known with an unsettling and potentially explosive rudeness. Indeed, even the social mobility that had been a fixture of American mythology would wither as economic sclerosis set in, as Niebuhr predicted ruefully when he wrote that, quote, "The American class structure will become more fixed as the nation moves toward the final limits of an expanding economy," end quote. Niebuhr could be just as far-seeing about the trajectory of containment, the diplomatic and military analog to the suppression of class conflict through prosperity. And he aimed his most acerbic critique of Cold War policy at the horrific folly of the war in Vietnam. The global extension of American power had entangled us, he recognized, in what he called a vast web of history, in which other peoples, quote, "running in oblique or contrasting directions to our own, inevitably hinder or contradict what we most fervently desire," end quote. Yet because the United States had so little experience navigating what Niebuhr called the endlessly complex compounds of ethnic loyalties, historic traditions, military strength, and ideological hopes, end quote, Niebuhr feared, anticipating here the insight of Graham Greene in The Quiet American, whose narrator said of his young CIA friend that he had never, quote, "he had never met a man who had better motives for all the trouble he caused." Niebuhr feared that the nation would move, quote, "with one direct leap from the use of economic to the use of military power," end quote. When the US did precisely this in Vietnam, Niebuhr took to the pages of the New Republic in January 1966 to declare that the war was, quote, "an impossible military and moral dilemma," end quote, and that the Johnson administration should desist from escalating American involvement. Niebuhr's admonition would seem to confirm not only his reputation as a steely-eyed sage, but the stature of Christian realism as a template for politics and a bridle on American hubris. Niebuhr warned that, however righteous American opposition to communism, the United States must bridle its own aspiration to master history, an ambition that is always a prideful and insidious illusion. Acting, so this tale goes, as a prophet to the national security state, Niebuhr urged American leaders to cultivate a twofold sense of irony: an appreciation of unintended consequences, and a capacity to identify the self-interest hidden under even the noblest professions of selflessness. Suspicious of idealism of any kind, Niebuhr insisted that politicians seek limited and proximate goals, not the grandiose and utopian objectives pursued by empires and revolutionaries. Such ideals always represented, in his view, an impossible and dangerous transposition to groups of standards appropriate to individuals. Quote, "It is not within the realm of moral possibility to ask a nation to be self-sacrificing," Niebuhr wrote. Thus, according to Christian realism, the inevitable clashes of self-interested groups could be tempered, but never eliminated. And peace could be achieved through the alignment of interest with interest, not a larger transformation of heart. By the same token, since idealism could both inflate one's own sense of righteousness and demonize one's opponents, realism about group self-interest would diminish rather than encourage violence. Niebuhr counseled humility, irony, and realism, in part out of an eschatological modesty, a reticence that rendered foolish any blueprint or schedule of history's consummation. Writing in the very frostiest days of the Cold War, Niebuhr feared that Americans, quote, lacked the humility to accept the fact that the whole drama of history is enacted in a frame of meaning too large for human comprehension or management, end quote. Indeed, to Niebuhr, the mythology of exceptionalism was more than a form of immodesty. It was an act of idolatry in which Americans worshiped their own graven image and likeness. Only repentance of this self-deification could divert Americans from the path of folly in his view. And once shorn of their idolatrous illusions about their nation's power, wisdom, and destiny, they could use their immense resources with greater prudence and generosity. Similarly, Niebuhr's opposition to pacifism stemmed from a particular political ontology. Like imperialists and revolutionaries, pacifists, Niebuhr thought, were naive in their conviction that ideals could be enacted in the turbulent contingencies of history. So, for example, when David Dellinger and other pacifist students at Union were expelled in 1940 for refusing to register for the draft, Niebuhr preached a sermon condemning not their lack of patriotism, but what he referred to as their arrogance. Putting the wisdom of serpents before the gentleness of doves, Niebuhr's realism could both sanction intimidation, violence, and deceit, and enjoin Christians to beg forgiveness for the commission of these necessary evils, because it refused to grant any political significance to love. Speaking especially to religious pacifists, Niebuhr asserted in the first volume of The Nature and Destiny of Man that the law of love stands on the edge of history, not in history. It represents an ultimate and not an immediate possibility, end quote. For Niebuhr, time was relentlessly unilinear. We have no access to the fullness of love that awaits us at the end of history. Love's appearance in our time can only be partial, at best, in this view. Agape must always defer to realpolitik. As Bertolt Brecht once put it, those who preached kindness could not themselves be kind. Both Niebuhr's political ontology and his eschatology rest on a secular conception of time, empty, homogeneous time, in Walter Benjamin's words, plodding and unredemptive, in which love will have to wait until the end of history, when all obstacles to its sway have disappeared. Until then, in Niebuhr's view, politics could only be, at best, an unending and often violent vocation in damage control. Now, this is the Niebuhr who continues to exercise a spell over politicians and intellectuals. From presidents, Jimmy Carter and Barack Obama both cited him as a major influence, to pundits such as David Brooks, to philosophers, theologians, and historians, Paul Ramsey, Jean Bethke Elshtain, Richard John Newhouse, and Andrew Bacevich, the latter Niebuhr's most able and sensitive contemporary acolyte. Yet the fact that such a spectrum could invoke Niebuhr should elicit not marvel at his bipartisan appeal, but rather suspicion of his bipartisan appeal, just as I think we should always be suspicious of anything bipartisan. Aside from Bacevich, perhaps, the Niebuhrians I just cited have comprised a roster of faithful imperial stewardship, willing and even eager to justify the most horrendous and inept of imperial crusades. So as sympathetic as I am to Niebuhrian appeals for greater modesty and self-restraint, I'm doubtful that Christian realism can really moderate or constrain imperial ambition. In his laudable eagerness to find historical precursors for his own critiques of American imperialism, Bacevich, I think, overlooks some real and intractable problems with his hero's work. Niebuhr adopted a fundamentally contradictory stance during the Cold War. Condemn American illusions of innocence and omnipotence, yet at the same time endorse a realistic posture against communism that entailed both the possible use of nuclear weapons and the repression of post-colonial revolutionary movements. Despite his imprecations against the reckless pride of American globalism, Niebuhr's conception of Cold War international politics as a never-ending conflict in which the children of light would have to employ the weapons of the children of darkness made it difficult for him to oppose anything the United States did. Niebuhr himself realized that calls for humility and circumspection on the part of American leaders were perfectly compatible with global dominion. Writing in Luce's Life magazine in September 1948, Niebuhr mused that, quote, "We will have to stand at every point of our far-flung lines," end quote. Later, noting in The Irony of American History that Egyptian and Mesopotamian city-states, quote, "were responsible for the order and cohesion of these first great empires in American history, in human history," end quote. Niebuhr opined that, quote, "the preponderant power of America may have a similar role to play in the present international scene," end quote. Note well that Niebuhr did not explicitly call upon the United States to withdraw its combat forces from Vietnam. This was not, I think, a mere default of logic. It was more fundamentally a default of imagination, a capitulation to the canons of realism enunciated by the military-industrial leviathan of the post-war corporate commonwealth. Niebuhr's demurral on Vietnam was indicative of his habitual deference to the ideological and political parameters of the Cold War establishment, of which he was a charter member. Niebuhr could not and never did see how the debacle in Vietnam stemmed from the very notions of communist malevolence and American indispensability that he shared with other liberal intellectuals, politicians, and policymakers. Like his fellow Cold Warriors, Niebuhr never really questioned the tenets of Wilsonian liberal internationalism, itself a progeny of that very messianic impulse that Niebuhr otherwise knew to be a source of terrible fanaticism. We and the rest of the world are still paying the price for American denial of and inattention to the intractable realities of the post-colonial world that was emerging in the wake of the Versailles Treaty and the end of the Second World War. At the same time, and by the same token, Niebuhr could not endorse a more radical reorganization of American society because he shared with liberals a truncated sense of political possibility, acquiescing in their circumscribed account of what was realistic. He and other liberal intellectuals counseled either resignation to malignant power or a decent modesty in its reform, anything but a, quote, sublime madness that he now castigated as either ineffectual or murderous. His abandonment of any meaningful socialist politics was bound up with an overvaluation of expertise, something endemic, I would contend, both to the liberal Protestant social gospel and to the entire progressive liberal lineage of American social and political thought, from John Dewey and Thorstein Veblen to Daniel Bell, John Kenneth Galbraith, and Cass Sunstein. To be fair, Niebuhr was no technocratic ideologue. In Irony, for instance, he warns against America's, quote, cult of technical efficiency and insists that, quote, "we are more desperately in need of genuine charity than of more technocratic skills," end quote. Yet an inclination toward managerialist politics was evident in Niebuhr's writing as early as the 1920s, but it surfaced most clearly during the Second World War. In The Children of Light and the Children of Darkness, Niebuhr went so far as to assert that, quote, "the professional class, who comprised, he believed, the most intelligent portions of American society, occupied, quote, a position of relative detachment from the ideological struggles of owners and producers," end quote. Niebuhr even redefined socialism not as the resolution of the property issue, through workers' control of production, but rather as the achievement of abundance and efficiency through benevolent managerial prowess. The modern economic order required, he now thought, quote, the best possible distribution of power for the sake of justice and the least possible management for the sake of order, end quote. A management provided precisely by the professional class, supposedly insulated from the imperatives of capital. This, in other words, is a restatement of the ideology of the end of ideology, as proclaimed by Daniel Bell in 1960, and which would later be restated by Francis Fukuyama as the end of history in the 1990s. In both cases, the exemplary Cold War restatement of the technocratic political imagination. Niebuhr also defaulted on the racial front, endorsing the small step strategy of white liberals that Martin Luther King Jr. would later dismiss as, quote, the tranquilizing drug of gradualism, end quote. Niebuhr's reluctance to support the newly combative civil rights movement was sadly ironic, as it belied his prescient speculation in moral man, based on his observations of Gandhi's successes in South Africa and India, that, quote, there is no problem of political life to which religious imagination can make a larger contribution than the problem of developing nonviolent resistance, end quote. Yet when confronted with so glorious a confirmation, Niebuhr retreats into equivocation. The Brown decision in 1954 satisfied Niebuhr that America's racial divisions were, quote, on the way of being resolved, end quote. Because, in words that sound positively Deweyan in their optimism, he credited, quote, the general tendency of increasing social intelligence to withdraw its support from the claims of social privilege, end quote. Yet Niebuhr expressed sympathy with Southern white parents who feared a decline in the educational standards of integrated schools, citing, in his words, cultural differences between the races, end quote. Later, responding to the Montgomery boycotts, Niebuhr went absolutely with conservatives such as Edmund Burke, invoking all kinds of hoary conservative chestnuts about organic processes in an effort to convince King and other leaders of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to check the movement's momentum. It was, in his words, politically unwise to advocate gradualism, but it was also, in his view, morally wise to practice it, end quote. In other words, we're quite a long way from the socialist firebrand of the summer of 1919. Thus, it's hard to see how a thinker whom the journalist Richard Rovere anointed the official establishment theologian could pose much of a threat to, well, the official establishment. His realism dovetailed well with the sonorous rhetoric of maturity and responsibility that was the lingua franca among courtier intellectuals such as Arthur Schlesinger Jr. and imperial mandarins such as McGeorge Bundy and Robert McNamara. As Niebuhr's biographer Richard Fox has observed, Niebuhr enabled such men, quote, to maintain faith in themselves as political actors in a troubled, what he termed, sinful world. Niebuhr taught that moral men had to play hardball, end quote. Covering themselves with guilt in order to fulfill some high responsibility, cold warriors could ravage Vietnam and other nations, recalling Niebuhr's solemn benediction on, quote, conscious choices of evil for the sake of good, end quote. Niebuhr should have recalled, or someone should have reminded him, that Pontius Pilate dispatched Jesus of Nazareth for the sake of the public order. Despite his chastisement of American hubris, Niebuhr was no, quote, prophet to the establishment, as Henry F. May once dubbed it. A rueful theologian of empire, Niebuhr was basically a Pontifex Maximus for Cold War elites, among whom Christian realism offered an ideological sanction for US foreign and military policy. Now, even if we set aside Niebuhr's reverential enlistment by the Cold War elite, His account of moral and political life is, I think, open to serious challenge. Although Niebuhr hoped that Christian realism could chasten ambition and civilize conflict, it's hard to see how it could ever do either, given Niebuhr's well-known pessimism about groups. His dismissal of the notion that nations could be self-sacrificing leads inexorably to a sense of futility, since the acute and profound consciousness of the capacity for sin that is central to Christian realism would have to be cultivated by a people, not just by virtuosi in introspection. It would demand a talent for contemplation and humility that would, presumably, constrain their inclination to self-delusion, vengeance, and malice. Yet Niebuhr himself observed that no political community in history has ever possessed this talent, at least not in any abundance. And it is an especially difficult talent to develop when, as among Americans, the identity of their community is inseparable from a conviction of errand, destiny, providence, or American century. As so often happens in his work, Niebuhr intensifies the consciousness of sin, yet offers us little but reflection on the tragedy of it all. Those unwilling to make the future a hostage to tragedy must either hope that the virtues indispensable for Christian realism can be nurtured among the elite, and the track record on that score is not encouraging, or forthrightly dispute the terms of Niebuhr's pessimism. They would have to counter, in the face of the ample historical evidence to the contrary, that charity, modesty, and self-sacrifice are indeed within the realm of moral possibility for groups and for nations. They would therefore have to contend with Niebuhr's insistence on realism, the feature of his political thinking that is usually considered most unassailable, but which I would suggest is in fact quite dubious and contestable. Realism, like other key words such as pragmatic, efficient, responsible, or serious, realism has always been a formidable weapon in the rhetorical arsenal of power, indispensable for clearing and protecting the moral and epistemological high ground. Any challenge to Niebuhrian realpolitik must begin, I think, not by sending a banal and ineffectual idealism into battle, but by exposing the fraudulence of many a hard-boiled claim to realism. Christian realists, I think, too readily cede the power to define reality, and therefore to define possibility, to the professional and managerial cadres of the national security state and the corporations. Yet, as Niebuhr himself might well have agreed, realism often turns out to be either an imprimatur on the status quo, quote, a mere surrender to the actual, as Randolph Bourne once put it so well, or realism turns out to be little more than the malignant illusion of the powerful. But if realism is not what it seems, then what appears to be Niebuhr's strongest point is in fact his Achilles heel. If what often passes for realism is so thoroughly suspect, then Christian realism is but a pious version of the counterfeit veracity of power. By deferring to the cognitive and political expertise of the imperial state, Christian realists both stoke imperial desire and thus ensure their own irrelevance, and obscure the range of moral and political possibility. So I think rather than lament the lack of hope or idealism, today's apostates from empire must reclaim the language of realism. They must be visionaries in the proper sense of the word, people who see what's really there, in fact and latent impossibility. It may turn out, ironically, that Niebuhrian realism paralyzes the moral and political imagination, not because it is realistic, but because it is not realistic enough. The shortcomings of Christian realism were apparent to A.J. Muste, Dutch Reformed minister, genuine socialist, and one of Niebuhr's keenest and most persistent critics. Today, Musty is remembered primarily as an anti-war and civil rights activist, engaging in civil disobedience with Dorothy Day, the Fellowship of Reconciliation, and the War Resisters League, and often literally holding a candle of peace against nuclear weapons and the Vietnam War. Like Niebuhr, Musty wrote and acted on the basis of a distinctive political ontology and eschatology that challenged the realism of Christian realism. While Niebuhr was right in his view to warn that all earthly power was ultimately, in Musty's words, ephemeral, weak, and doomed, end quote, Musty believed that history contained a wider range of possibilities. Nonviolence and radical change were practical and realistic, Musty believed, because the love that Niebuhr banished to the end of history was available in the here and now. Quote, the divine is always about to break into history, in Musty's words. Against Niebuhr's secular, linear, homogeneous time, Musty posed an ontological and eschatological alternative, what theologians sometimes call a realized eschatology. The past, he reflected, quote, does not simply grind out the future through the sieve of the present, end quote. For Musty, every moment was the gate through which the Messiah could enter. The present and the future, in this view, are somehow simultaneous and permeable. The here and now is open to incursion from the kingdom. The future can interrupt and transform our time. Every act of love to Musty is a visit to the kingdom and brings the future into the present tense. Quote, love can change history, Musty insisted, because time, having more than one direction, is always on our side. Musty conceded that love offered no greater guarantee of success than reliance on money and weapons, the arsenal of fear that provides the world with its bloody and evanescent security. The partisans of love would inevitably suffer obloquy, exile, even death. The main reason Musty suspected that guile and violence seemed to be safer options, even for Christian realists. But in the end, Musty mused, there simply is no safety in our futile efforts to secure ourselves in time. All attempts to completely master our fates conclude in ashes and ruin and butchery. Nothing really belongs to us in this view. So by accepting the vulnerability that comes with the eschewal of possession and violence, the pacifist is what Musty referred to as the supreme realist. However draped in the changing rhetorical fashions of liberal democratic capitalism, the American quest for imperial mastery was yet another vain grasp at eternity. And like that of an earlier empire, the nation's pursuit of global supremacy was a snare and a delusion. Quote, in its way, the Roman Empire was real enough, but its power structure was not permanent, not real. It was the house built on sand, end quote. For Musty, the problem lay not in the nature of groups, but in the reluctance to live without dominion. Forswearing ultimate allegiance to the principalities that were rooted in dust. The vanguard of this kind of politics of love must be, quote, loose and experimental, living as lightly tethered as possible to the world of business and empire. They might even lead their fellow citizens to a happier, if humbler, destiny. For one never knew when the other side of history would swoop in and transform the time. Love can change history, as Musty asserted, for, quote, love is mightier than dominion, end quote. To be sure, Musty could be no less insistent than Niebuhr on the ironies of historical action, referring to the earliest Christians who expected the heavenly city and instead merely inherited the Roman Empire. Musty observed that, quote, what came about did not resemble their dreams. But he then mused that, quote, it never does. Corruption was mingled with glory, end quote. But this recognition of the ineradicable ambiguity of history did not induce Musty, as it did Niebuhr, to counsel resignation to the sinful necessities of subterfuge and occasional carnage. In Musty's view, there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in realpolitik. So if, in his view, reality is not what men tend to call the real, if the world is an ampler and more generous place than the faithless are compelled to make it, then love is a power, not just an ideal. As Musty had written in 1940, quote, there are in our universe resources for living the life of love which we have hardly begun to tap, but which we must learn to draw upon, end quote. Musty's conviction that a politics of love was more practical than Niebuhrian realism was shared by an array of Cold War radicals, often dubbed personalists by historians. The Catholic workers led by Dorothy Day, the participants in several communes or intentional communities, such as Clarence Jordan's Quanonia Farm, the loose coalition of secular and religious intellectuals who wrote for the journal Liberation, including Musty, Day, Dellinger, Bayard Rustin, Dwight MacDonald, Paul Goodman, and a host of others who prefigured a, quote, new left, dissociated from Marxism and social democracy. And eventually, elements of that new left itself, the partisans of beloved community, who permeated the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and Students for a Democratic Society. What distinguished personalism from other forms of post-war radicalism was its double focus on personal and political renewal, its commitment to the idea that existential metamorphosis, what Paul Tillich called the courage to be, was bound up with political transformation. I think that any new radicalism must begin from a faith in the possibilities of the here and now, a realized eschatology, if you will, the future in the present tense. Living in the new world, in the wreckage of the old. Something Reinhold Niebuhr, too sure in the serenity of the ruling elite, would not and cannot help us do. Thanks.
So now we have time for questions and I'm sure answers.
I don't know about that.
Sir, what's the name of the what's the first name of Musty? One more time.
Oh, it's AJ, Augustus John was his name, but he was referred to as AJ Musty.
AJ. Thank you so much.
Sure. There's a great book about, it just came to mind. There's a great book, biography of Musty, by Lila Danielson, entitled, I think quite appropriately, American Gandhi. It came out, I want to say 2 or 3 years ago.
Thank you so much.
Answered all the questions.
Well, thanks for coming, folks.
Well, let's just give it, if you don't mind, let's give it another minute. Because I mean, I know that some of you have been a little more sympathetic to Niebuhr than Professor McCarraher just was. I mean, do you want to? I don't know if you want to push back, or if you just want to probe a little bit more about where Professor McCarraher is coming from. Yeah.
So I just have a general question. Would you mind going back through why the pacifist is the supreme realist for Musty? And would you maybe give a little bit more about that?
Sure. I think there are basically two reasons why Musty considers the pacifist to be the supreme realist. The first one is, I think, one on which, it seems to me pretty obvious he can draw historically, which is that all empires have faded into dust. I'm reminded sometimes of that Shelley poem, Ozymandias. I don't know if the rest of you know it. It's a very short poem in which Shelley is talking about this cracked and fallen idol that's lying in the desert. And what it says on the bottom of it is, look at me, Ozymandias, and fear, right, and tremble. And, there it is lying cracked and broken in the desert. So I think Musty, on the one hand, would argue that all empires think that they will last forever. All empires claim, at least, to be embarking on some kind of civilizing mission. I mean, whether it's the Romans or the British, for that matter. And they're always maintained by violence. The British would often say that the sun never sets on the Union Jack, and as one wit once put it, and the blood never dries either. So you've got empires always justifying their violence and their repression for some kind of greater good. So that's one set of reasons. But the other one is one that I think is specifically religious and theological, and I think that's the one where I talked about what I think is Musty's and Niebuhr's differing conceptions of temporality, and the relationship between the present and the future. Niebuhr's conception of time is, as I said, utterly modern and unilinear, right? I mean, time goes in one direction. So to imagine that you can somehow draw on some power from the future is nonsensical, right, in this view. Whereas Musty, I would contend, has a much more classically theological conception of time, which is the future, or the eschaton, or the kingdom of God, lies in the future, but it can also somehow have an impact in the present, and through some sort of personal practice, ritual, prayer, I dare say, you can draw on this power from the future. Now, obviously, this is a view that is somehow rooted in a faith and a hope that it seems to me that a simply unilinear conception of time just cannot give you. And you also, I think also what's important here, and maybe this is a third reason, separate from the other two, is that Niebuhr always talks about love as an ideal, right? It's something that is sort of up here to which we should aspire, right? Musty talks about love as a power. Musty talks about it as something that both is an agent and enables a form of agency. I think that that's more than just a difference in rhetoric. I really think that that's a difference in how one thinks about love. I would contend, and this shameless self-promotion here, I mean, this is part of what I think is what I would argue is a current running through my second book. I think that the capital R romantics of the modern era are people who don't just talk about love as an ideal. They actually believe that love is a power and an agency on which one can draw in the here and now. And so I think Musty is much more aligned with that sort of capital R romantic account of temporality. I guess what I'm underlining here is that the way one thinks about ontology and the way one thinks about the nature of time really does have political consequences. we tend to think that politics and metaphysics are somehow, like in different compartments. I don't think they are. The way that you think about time and the way that you think about space and the way that you think about the very nature of the universe has political implications.
Awesome, thank you.
I have a question. It's a little half-baked, so my apologies for that. I was really interested in your discussion of the way in which the American imperialists who claim at least inspiration from Niebuhr use this language of guilt to kind of like affectively cloak their acceptance of Niebuhr's principle that one can do immoral acts for moral reasons, and therefore the act is moral in some capacity. I guess my question is, for those idealists or pacifists like Musty, those who reject Niebuhr's notion that our political acts and principles will never live up to the moral aspirations which inspire them, is there a role for guilt? Is there a place for, is there an acknowledgement of the struggle, at least, for political principles to live up to moral aspirations and the disparity sometimes between them? I guess, what do you see as the role of guilt within a more pacifistic approach to this?
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's not a half-baked question. That's a fully baked question.
Poorly articulated then, perhaps.
It's a difficult one. Wow, I almost want to say I'll get back to you on that one, but I guess I would say that if there's a role for guilt to play in a kind of pacifist politics, it would be, I mean, certainly as a check on what can be pacifists' own inclination to self-righteousness. I mean, I think that Musty himself was aware of this. I think Dorothy Day and the Catholic workers certainly were. I think also that the role of guilt in pacifism might be this, and this is actually something that Stanley Hauerwas once said. I heard him say it in a lecture. I don't know if he's supposed to speak to you as well, so you might want to check me on this. I might have misheard him, but he once said that pacifists are not people who don't realize that if, for example, you don't do something, that everything's going to be okay. It might not be okay. And so pacifists, to some degree, have to accept a certain degree of responsibility for what happens or doesn't happen if they are successful. And I say that. I mean, I want to be very careful here. I mean, I say that as somebody who would not characterize himself as a pacifist. I do think that there are instances in which one could justify the legitimate use of violence to prevent an evil. What I'm attacking here is Niebuhr's conception of realism. I don't think that Musty's conception of, I guess, political ontology or political agency necessarily eventuates in pacifism. I think, yeah, that was a fully baked question. I wish I was ready for that one.
No, thank you. That was helpful. Thank you.
Struggling to answer.
No, that was very helpful. I'll have to keep thinking on that.
The other participants on Zoom, I guess there are two others. Feel free to unmute yourselves and ask a question if you would like.
You're welcome.
Hey.
Is that Karen or is that you, Charles?
It's Karen.
Oh, hi.
Charles he's downstairs watching too. I can hear him sighing and stuff. I hope he's on mute, but yeah, we're all here representing. So great to see you. Thanks for including me.
Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna go quiet now.
So I have a question that might also be a little half-baked. And it's that the more I'm thinking about it, the more it seems like Niebuhr wants to combine an empirical observation about human behavior with a, he wants to combine reason with revelation, that he looks around and sees human beings behaving badly. But he also comes to that observation with the doctrinal conviction that of original sin.
Right.
I'm wondering for you, Professor McCarraher, if you reject the doctrine of original sin, or if you just reject Niebuhr's interpretation of it or application of it.
The latter. Man, I'll tell you, I've been going back and forth for the last few years with David Bentley Hart about this. And even though I'm a Roman Catholic, I have to say that I find the Eastern Orthodox conception of original sin more and more convincing. I think the argument that the conception of original sin that we've had for the last, I guess, millennium and a half, as shaped by Augustine, is just insupportable. This notion of an inherited guilt that's transmitted through the ages is based on mistranslation of in the Vulgate. I think David Bentley Hart's very convincing about that. But I still do believe in original sin in the sense that we live in a world that is so structured that it's inevitable. That we're all born into a world now that is so structured that it's inevitable that we will do wrong, which I don't think is quite the same thing as what the Augustinian Calvinist sort of tradition would argue. So I don't reject the doctrine of original sin. I simply think that Niebuhr's understanding of it is erroneous. And again, I think that how one understands original sin does have political consequences. I think that the more, I don't know, I'd be willing to argue about this. I don't have a really sort of, I'm not wedded to this position, but I think that the more intractable one's sense of original sin, the more conservative one tends to be, because you just tend to think, well, there's really nothing that's going to change much about people, so why bother? And this is, and again, this is something where I think Niebuhr is often in tension with himself, or he's contradictory, because he remained within the fold of American liberalism. I mean, in other words, in a reformed tradition. After he left the socialist ranks.
Yeah, Lily.
Well, I was just asking, I'm not Eastern Orthodox, but I was trying to look up what their kind of interpretation of original sin is. And it says, they explicitly deny that humanity inherited guilt from anyone. Rather, they maintain that we inherit our fallen nature. But is that not, I'm a little confused about the differentiation between Niebuhr's perception of original sin and what you said was probably more.
Niebuhr, oh no, go ahead.
You take off.
Okay. Niebuhr's conception of original sin, at least to the extent I'm able to understand it, is not at all different from what we conceive of as the Augustinian, notion of inherited guilt and an inherited sin. Whereas the Eastern Orthodox, and I guess this is something where you'd have to read David Bentley Hart, or other Eastern Orthodox theologians on this. when they say something like, we inherit our fallen nature, they don't understand it in the sense of an inherited guilt, right? It's a much, I think in some ways it's a conception of original sin that is much more amenable to the idea of history, and it's much more amenable, I think, also to frankly radical politics. I mean, it's not, I think, at all an accident that, for example, David Hart has been moving in a much more leftward direction over the last 10 years, even though he wouldn't characterize it that way. I mean, David is loath to put himself on a right-left spectrum, but I mean, as in terms of that right-left spectrum, he's been moving ever closer, I think, to anarchism, if anything. So, yeah, Niebuhr's understanding is pretty much the Augustinian Calvinist, that lineage of understanding original sin.
Sorry, I had heard similar language, and so I just wanted to differentiate.
Sir, I don't really have I guess it's sort of a question. It's more like I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. Something that, well, I also really like David Bentley Hart, and I love listening to him.
Can you just briefly say who David Bentley Hart is, just in case somebody in here
Sure.
had never heard of him?
David Bentley Hart is an Eastern Orthodox theologian and cultural critic who writes about, a lot of things.
Everything, essentially. Yeah.
He's really fun to listen to, but yeah, I agree. I think that the original sin piece, I think, is really good. Something that attracts me to Niebuhr is, and this is because of my own research, my own theological research, is Niebuhr's sense of the kind of neediness and fragility and finitude of human beings. I find that really attractive. I find that really interesting. And I wonder, like I said, this isn't so much a question as I'm wondering what, to hear your thoughts on it. I wonder how that kind of sense of finitude and sort of weakness interacts with how he understands power in society. I'm sorry, I wish I had more to say about it, but do you get a sense in Niebuhr that kind of the kind of fallibility and weakness and finitude of human beings really is maybe a strength in Niebuhr's thinking, is a realistic portion of his kind of realism? Can you say more about that?
Sure. I think it's a strength, but I also think there's a way in which he thinks about finitude that can be a problem. I mean, the first, to say something positive about it. Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons that Niebuhr emphasizes finitude and weakness is precisely to identify what's so insidious about our pretensions to try to master history. You can't do it, precisely because we're finite. It's impossible for us to master all the circumstances of our lives. It simply can't be done. And the effort to do so will inevitably lead to evil. And so, I think we're always better off just admitting that we are limited. We're limited creatures, and that's okay. Right? I mean, it seems to me that if you take seriously the doctrine of creation, the fact that we are indeed limited and fleshly and evanescent is a good thing. We generally tend to, associate words like evanescence and weakness, and we identify them as bad things or things that are unfortunate, and they're not. We don't say that about the beauty of a sunset. We don't say it about a lot of things that we know are fleeting, but it doesn't make them bad. Now, what I find problematic about what Niebuhr says about finitude, and maybe this is a more persnickety theological point, I think that he associates all of that with sin, right? But they're not sin, right? Finitude is finitude. Weakness is weakness. They're not. I think that Niebuhr has a tendency to see these things in association, or he makes too close an association of these things with sin. I really think that's a problem. Like I said, just being finite is not in itself sinful.
Right. Thank you very much.
He just wrote a book on, Dave Bentley Hart just I don't know, 2-3 years ago, wrote a book on universalism. Everybody is ultimately saved, essentially. And he is he is just totally dismissive of the opposite argument. Totally dismissive.
I happen to think he's right.
I happen to think he's right too, but he's totally dismissive.
That he is. Yeah, he has no patience with the what he calls the infernalist argument. Yeah. I also, I hope David, is paying me for this, because I'm plumping for him here. I would also highly recommend his translation of the New Testament, which he calls a transliteration rather than a translation. I don't know how many of you maybe know Greek. I don't know Greek, but when you read it, I'm told that it really is the closest thing to the original Greek, and how it sounds, and how the sentences are constructed, that a lot of readers have ever seen. It's a really remarkable achievement, from what I understand.
So I have one more question, or maybe slight pushback. So your talk is about how why Reinhold Niebuhr is not the theologian that we need today, and I think you make some really powerful points about the limitations that he puts on people's imagination, that he can put on people's imagination, specifically in the political realm. And I think you're really onto something there.
But
and then maybe today, 2021, you're just plain right. But I wonder, and you might know more about how seriously somebody like Martin Luther King Jr. meant it when he said that, Niebuhr taught me something. And how seriously, I don't know if Bonhoeffer ever actually said, explicitly, Niebuhr really taught me something, but in reading Charles's biography, you see that, it looks like Niebuhr really taught him something. And King in particular is somebody who really changes the course of history. You see the power of love, which I think, and I don't know what you think. I think King interprets love more in agape terms than Niebuhr interprets love. Niebuhr seems to talk about love as an emotion, and I think King sees love in a different way. Something not really an emotion, not something that you necessarily have to feel. But so there seems to be evidence that people who changed history really learned some valuable things from Niebuhr. And like I said, maybe those people themselves are not so historically relevant to today as they might have been 20, 30 years ago. but how would you respond to that?
Well, I mean, King clearly did write that Niebuhr had influenced him. You know, he has that chapter in, oh my God, I'm blanking on the name of his book about the Montgomery.
The Stride to Freedom.
Stride Toward Freedom. He has that chapter entitled Pilgrimage to Nonviolence, in which he explicitly says that, yeah, Niebuhr was a big influence on me. But I think the influence on Niebuhr, well, two things. I mean, one is the influence that Niebuhr had on him was as a reminder of the tendency to cloak, you know, some base motives in the rhetoric of idealism, right? And Niebuhr also taught King that one had to be careful about precisely that, about the inclination we often have to not pay close enough attention to our own motives. And that's you know, that's all to the good. But then King turns around at, you know, at some point in that chapter and says, yeah, but Niebuhr has his limits, you know, and one of them is that you're not going to get a whole lot of what Niebuhr himself referred to as, you know, sublime madness, to actually, you know, take the risk to embark on political transformation. And this is something that you know, that King got from Gandhi. You know, so there's a sense in which that chapter, it's as though King is sort of playing off Niebuhr and Gandhi, and trying to see what kinds of virtues he can draw from each one of them. Yeah, and look, you know, I'm not, like I said, I'm here to praise Niebuhr and to bury him. And so I do think that Niebuhr does have important lessons to teach. It's just that I think we need to. I think there are better theologians and religious figures to teach us those lessons. Because I think Niebuhr has been I think he's been compromised by his association with Cold War policy elites and opinion elites. You know, I think his views on the civil rights movement, you know, for example, I think were inexcusable. I mean, I don't see. I think King was absolutely right to characterize, you know, views like that as the, you know, the tranquilizing drug of gradualism.
Yeah. Thanks. Are there any people you would list off the top of your head that are better theologians for today? You just.
Hey, you're not going to get me on tape, you know, saying something like that. You know, I mean, you know, Stanley Hauerwas, William Cavanaugh. You know, I always go back and forth about John Milbank because I think there's so much in John that's good, but then sometimes John has these utterly unfathomable positions that he takes on things that I just roll my eyes. J. Cameron Carter, I think that his book on race, on theology and race, is just absolutely invaluable as both a historical and a theological document. So yeah, that's off the top of my head.
Yeah, thanks.
I guess I don't, you know, yeah, I would also recommend, I guess, a colleague at Villanova, Vince Lloyd. You know, I've learned a lot from his work as well.
Any last questions or comments before we let Professor McCarraher go? All right, thank you very much for this
Sure. My pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Okay, take care, everyone.